reason I like to start with a little embodied meditation, or I like to think of it as connecting, is it helps me connect with you. And for people that are watching this after, outside of the live event, it also helps connect across time and space with those people too. So, and I trust that they will find it at the right time when they need it. So one thing I know about Psyche is it is not terribly interested in temporal reality and time and space. And so it's very easy to connect even over Zoom across, oceans. So doing this little exercise will help us ground into that, connect to ourselves and connect to the anima mundi as well. So I'll guide you, and then we'll come out gently and slowly, and there's no hurry back. And then I'll probably do a bit of an introduction about myself and my work, and we'll just see where it goes and what happens. Okay. So I'll invite you to just relax. If you're comfortable, you can close your eyes. You may prefer to turn your video off, whatever your comfort level is. And just sink into your body and into this moment. And inhale deeply through your nose. And sigh it out through your mouth. And twice more. And just invite your body to relax, to find ease, to release any tension that it might be holding. Notice the seat that you're sitting in. If you're leaning against anything, notice where you're held and supported. And allow yourself to relax into receiving support. And now with your imagination, imagine that you can see a beam of white light coming down from the cosmos. And that white light comes into the crown of your head, the top of your head. And it fills your skull. Your whole head glows with light. You receive the light. And down into your throat. Notice how easily and fluidly the light flows in. It moves into your chest and your lungs and your shoulders. Notice with your breath how the light expands and fills your body, flowing effortlessly. Notice how the light flows down your shoulders and arms and out your hands, out your fingertips. Little laser beams of light floating through your arms and out your fingertips. Allow the light to fill your whole torso, your rib cage, your abdomen, your pelvis. It all fills and expands and flows with this beautiful cosmic white light. Notice how it fills your seat, your thighs, your legs, your upper legs, your knees, your lower legs, down to your feet. Your whole body filled with white light, radiant light, divine light. And bring your attention to the soles of your feet. Maybe notice any sensation, maybe the temperature, maybe there's a tingling sensation in the soles of your feet. And imagine that white light comes out the soles of your feet as roots. The white light turns into roots coming out of the soles of your feet. And those roots grow. They're powerful and strong. And they grow down deep into the earth. Imagine the roots connecting you down into the earth, growing further and further, stronger and stronger. Imagine a light at the core of the earth, a radiant light. Maybe it's a warm color. And the roots intermingle with the core of the earth, nourishing and exchanging energy. Maybe that light at the core of the earth is the world's soul, or the anima mundi. Notice how you're connected to the anima mundi, and your being connects you all the way up to the divine and the cosmos. And this beautiful connection from the sky all the way to the core of the earth, moving through your body and your being, and you're part of it. You belong. Allow yourself to find strength in those roots and in that connection. And just maintain that connection and that ease, the ease in your body. And I'm going to gradually bring you out of it. There's no hurry and no rush at all. And stay connected. Staying relaxed. I'm going to bring your attention to your breath. Inhale through your nose. And sigh it out through your mouth. And twice more. And staying in this relaxed place, we're going to gradually bring our attention back to our environments. So you can slowly blink open your eyes. Stay a bit fuzzy at first, there's no hurry. Return to your environment where you're physically sitting gently. Look around at the objects. When you're ready, you can come back to the screen. Make eye contact with a few people in the time that feels right. Notice each other. Come back together. And just maintain that ease and connectivity. Try not to lose it. And we'll just move into our discussion and our chat. I might start with a bit of an introduction about myself and my work and how I come to be here. And then maybe I'll invite Asher to add anything at that point. I am a doctor of depth psychology. My master's and Ph.D. is in depth psychology. which is essentially the study of the unconscious and is in service to the soul. I did my doctoral research on the archetype of the Wild Woman, which then evolved into a book called Tracking the Wild Woman Archetype, a guide to becoming a whole, indivisible woman. And that was published by Chiron Publications in 2018. And then out of that book, I was invited to teach at Pacifica Graduate Institute, where I had graduated from. And I started teaching the Psyche and Eros, the psychology and mythology of romantic love is the course. So I teach there. It's a 800 level course. So it's students that are quite steeped in depth psychology at that point. Usually they're second or third year Ph.D. students. And so I took the content from that course and I developed this book, Love and Soul Making, Searching the Depths of Romantic Love, which is my second book. It came out this year in May. And it explores both of the books explore the myth of Psyche and Eros. That myth has been with me at least 10 years, maybe longer. I originally presented at a conference 10 years ago on Eros, and that was, I think, probably when I was first publicly working with the content. Or more exactly, the content was first publicly working with me. Yeah, and so with those publications, somehow that found its way to Asher and to the Fifth Element, and here we are. Is there anything you might want to add to that introduction, Asher?
Oh, no, only to say, I think that people that have been in the Fifth Direction community for a little while now would already be resonating with everything you said there and know why. At least for me personally, I'm so excited to have connected with you and to have you, speaking to our group. I guess on a more specific level, Stacey, and I mentioned this to you yesterday. Earlier in the year we were studying Psyche and Eros, and we spent actually a good 3 months with the story, maybe more, really kind of digging in to what was there for us. And our particular perspective on it, as a few of us who knew the story quite well anyway, was to look at it from a kind of a non-binary point of view, with a queer lens on it. And that really kind of reshaped the story, at least for me, and opened me up to all sorts of edges that I hadn't been previously aware of. So it was actually a beautiful experience. But along the way, Stacey, I came across the podcast that you did your interview with Women in Depth. And obviously, you were speaking directly to the story of Psyche and Eros. And I was just riveted by everything that you had to say. It was really quite profound for me. So I started looking at some of the other work that you have in the world and really found a deep resonance. It seems so on point with everything that we were exploring within the Fifth Direction. So it just made absolute sense to reach out to you, and you were gracious enough to connect back, and here we are. And I'm just really feeling blessed to have this conversation, and also to see what else might unfold. But I guess with that in mind, in terms of a question, in looking at this idea of romance and love, it's definitely been a topic that we've talked about a lot in our community, and a lot of my understanding has been referenced through Robert Johnson's work, in particular, the book We. Where he looks actually at the story of Tristan and Isolde, which we've also worked with in the community quite recently. But I guess as an opening gambit, I might ask you, does your work, does your book, Love and Soul Making, follow similar lines, or could you note any particular differences you have with Robert Johnson's work?
Mhm. Yeah, there's so you may have to help me pick up threads as we go along. There's one piece I wanted to go back to where you were working with the myth and queering the myth. And there's two things I want to say about that. One is a really different perspective can happen if you just gender swap from Psyche and Eros, right? So imagining the different roles playing out as opposite genders, which can be quite, I find it quite revelatory about the influence of the patriarchal model on society, right? But it just allows a completely different perspective. This whole, what at this point I would call it a problem of gender in describing the feminine and masculine archetypes as engendered is we are at such an exciting time where gender is just the binary of gender is being so challenged, both psychically as individuals and obviously within the culture and collective as a whole too. So for quite a few years now, when I started researching tracking the Wild Woman, the anima animus figure, so I'm of the orientation that I was of the orientation, it's evolving, that men and women and non-binary people have access to the anima animus figures within their psyches. But that's actually been shifting since I started the research, which is some time ago now, where often those figures would present as shapeshifters or hermaphrodites. And so the personification just wasn't even a binary gender anymore. Now, usually it is, but definitely not always. And the profound dreams, the anima animus figure is no longer a specific gender. So the start of love and soul making began with a dream of a man giving birth to a girl child, like a really non-binary figure, right? And then I had to take care of the girl child and raise it, which I think is the book. Like symbolically, I think that was the book. So close to the end of this book, Thomas More offered to review it, which was amazing for me. And he picked up on the struggle with the words masculine and feminine archetypes and principles. And he said, I've just stopped using them. They're too problematic. And so one of the words I had come across so I did a substantial revision and I tried to take out a lot of the terms masculine and feminine as principles, not as men and women. And I replaced anima animus because I was using it as a hyphenated and that got awkward. So I replaced it with the term animum, which is Latin, and it neutralizes it. It's no longer gender specific when you put the um on the end of it. And I feel pretty good about that. And it's not new. It's starting to appear at Pacifica for all of the same reasons. The binary is just not fitting. So introducing a neutralized term for anima animus then starts to get us out of this gender binary problem a little bit more. Also words like yin yang and soul luna, but they're not personified, which is also a problem. It has to be personified. The psyche wants to personify. So yeah, that was a big rabbit hole. Now I've forgotten the first question that you actually asked me.
Well, I'm glad you spoke to that piece, though, because that's that makes a lot of sense to me, and it's interesting that you had that kind of tussle even within the writing of the book, which was a while ago. So yeah, and well, the piece that I was asking really was around other works out there in the world that are kind of discussing this idea of romance and love, particularly through the lens of that myth and others. And I referenced Robert A. Johnson's work, and I was wondering.
Yes.
I'm assuming you've
that
read
fits.
it. Yeah.
Yeah. It actually takes up a good chunk of, I think, chapter 2 in this book, inviting Robert Johnson's perspective on romantic love. And I'm a big fan of his work. The really big piece that is resonant for depth psychology and for my work that he articulates so exceptionally, he's so articulate, is that recognizing it's an inner process. So there's an inner marriage and an external union. And the seeking externally is, it really needs to be understood metaphorically and symbolically, particularly when we're up against relationships where somebody's not behaving the way we want them to be behaving, or, you know, we feel stuck in a particular place in our lives or in a relationship. So understanding the metaphorical and symbolic value of romantic love internally, as well as how do we, you know, the affects and the complexes that come up through human romantic love, it's a paradox because both things are true, right? So Robert Johnson, to go back to him, he refers to the inner king and queen, and the anima belongs as the inner queen beside the inner king. And the external human partner love, much to my chagrin, he refers to it as stirring the oatmeal love. And the first time I read that, I was fairly mortified because, you know, it sounds so bland, but it is a really good metaphor in that it's nourishing and it is dealing with the mundane and the day-to-day. And it's much more about companionship and somebody whose company you just enjoy, rather than having them fulfill that role of the inner king or queen, right? So he's a fantastic author, and I would recommend all three of his books, actually, He, She, and We, along with, you know, many others. The one thing I would say where I differ from him is he is very solidly in the Jungian wheelhouse, which means he's of a model of the self with the capital S, where you know, that's a very monotheistic model. There's a one God, there's a one self, there's a one greater than. Where archetypal psychology, which is James Hillman's kind of gift to depth psychology, he brought in the many, right? So the pantheon, or the polytheism. So we can view Jung and Hillman as kind of proponents of the one and the many. And my personal orientation, which is just a tension that I hold, I will vacillate between speaking about the one and the self and managing the tension of the opposites. And I will swing also in a different conversation, or maybe even the same conversation, to the archetypal perspective, where we have a pantheon and the polytheistic vantage points available to us. So people like Robert Johnson are very squarely grounded in this monotheistic orientation, where we're reconciling opposites towards a greater whole, where archetypal psychology isn't necessarily reconciling those opposites. That's not the objective or the goal.
I like that. There's a couple of pieces that I might pick up on. One is I'd never really seen the idea of the one God and the many gods as a tension to dance with. It just that tension is present in my life, but I don't think I'd ever actually named it and realized that I do swing from one to the other, possibly on a moment by moment basis sometimes. You know.
Yeah.
You know, I'm reminded of your fellow Canadian Stephen Jenkinson. He talked about this idea of if all the gods were sitting around a fire, and the god that thought he was the one god came and joined them, they would be like, welcome, you know, you're the god that thinks there's only one, come and join us, because there's of course a god for everything.
Yes,
so
exactly.
This just happens to be the god that thinks there's only one god, and that's perfectly okay, come join us.
Yeah, exactly.
I thought that was just such a wonderful little way of framing it, to be able to hold the tension.
To hold both, and that's quite important for me, to be able to hold both, but to also recognize when I'm reading an author what their orientation is, because honestly, following depth psychology, they're usually oriented to one or the other, either archetypal or because Jung has been producing Jungians to his chagrin for decades, there's a lot of people that are quite oriented to the self, monotheism. And of course, that just lends itself to Western psychology, where we come from this very top-down one God, Sky Father belief system, right? Whether that's actively part of our practice or not, it's part of our culture,
Yeah, I
The
think.
other,
Go on.
I was going to say, because you asked for some other suggestions, the other author I like on romantic love, who's also quite steeped in the Jungian self model, is James Hollis. And he wrote a book called The Eden Project, which is also a very good book on it. And then Thomas More, who I mentioned, I'm a huge fan of Thomas More's work. He's one of my favorite authors. And he was an analsand of James Hillman, where Hillman was an analsand of Jung. So he's got and he was a theologian. So, and comes at depth psychology from the perspective of a theologian, which is also very interesting. So his book, Soulmates and Care of the Soul, although it's less about relationship, Soulmates is another one that's very specifically about relationship, which is a great book. He tends he tends to understand that tension between the one and the many, and I am not honestly sure where he would land with that, because he's quite close to both thinkers, philosophers, right? Mm-hmm.
That's an interesting one, and yes, I would second that with their work. Particularly, at least for me, James Hollis has had a very big influence on me, for sure, through his books. Yeah, I was actually thinking about Jung himself, who seems to be able to, I guess, hold some of that tension. I don't know if he actually said this, but I do love the quote, I am not a Jungian.
Yes, exactly.
Which he
Yeah,
said,
he
which
did
really,
say that himself.
yeah,
Yes.
which kind of shows us exactly where his mind was, in this kind of thinking. But I wanted to kind of rewind just a little bit, because I'm fascinated that you kind of shuddered at Johnson's terminology, the stirring the oatmeal, because I actually quite liked it. I liked the idea. It felt like it almost took the weight off my shoulders a little bit. And I think that was largely because of my own personal experience. I'd for sure been projecting my animum onto partners over the journey, and I think that was creating very unhealthy relationships for me. So to hear it framed that way, it's like, oh, they're just a regular human being, and like me, and I shouldn't be putting any more pressure on them than that, and some sort of divine being that they could never kind of live up to.
Yes, and that's exactly it, is recognizing the other is not a divine being. They're just ordinary with ordinary fallibilities and flaws and all of the, things that are part of the human condition, right?
I think
Yeah.
another person who speaks to that very well is Marion Woodman.
Yeah.
She's obviously very quite forthcoming in terms of her, in terms of her relationship, and I think it was in Dancing in the Flames where she says there was this moment, and they were quite elderly at this stage, when she saw her husband just, in his saggy pants up at the kitchen, just making a cup of coffee,
Making his toast.
yeah, or whatever it was, and that
I
was
know
her,
the quote. Yeah.
and that was when it all kind of clicked in for her, and I think that it gives us all hope, doesn't it?
Yes. That little clip in that particular video, where she looks at the camera and she says, I could have done better. I could have. Just thought, she's so sassy. She's so cute. But she recognized him as a human, and accepted that. And she does talk often about the bumps that they experience through their marriage, and she's very generous that way, and grounding it in human experience, for sure. Yeah.
And I guess,
she does.
yeah, I guess that leads me on to another question for you, and that is, one of the things that drew me towards the depth framework was that when you're working with a depth psychologist, they're right there with you. That the whole process is about meeting you completely, and that means offering up yourself and your own experiences as well. Whereas I've found, and maybe this is the case for people listening as well, when you're working with counselors or therapists, and in any shape or form. Often there's this wall, there's this barrier. It's like, you tell me all about you, but I'm just a blank piece of paper to you. And it can take away some of that humanness. And I believe that change can only happen when both people are fully immersed. Both need to be changed by the experience, both the counselor and the other. And that's essentially, at least to my understanding, kind of one of the basis points of what depth psychologist is all about, or depth psychology. And so, for me, that's why, that's what really draws me to it. There's a certain humanness to it. Would you agree with all that?
Yeah, and I think you just articulated it so well. The depth so I am a clinical therapist as well. That is actually my main work that I do in the world. And you can't, as a depth therapist, you can't have a lot of clients because they're real relationships that require real relationship management and real conversations and real boundaries and real sitting in the muck and figuring things out together. So these types of therapists that can, see 8 clients a day, I'm like, oh, I don't know what they're doing, but I know it's not depth psychology, because that just energetically, you couldn't possibly do that. So it is, they're very much of like being together in the transference and countertransference field, and what's happening for the client and what's happening for the therapist. And depending on the client's level of awareness with depth psychology, very often that field is talked about, which is usually very helpful in healing. And Jung certainly said that the therapist will be, or he called them physicians usually in this context, would be changed through the process of the therapy. And if they weren't changed, then there probably wasn't a lot of therapy happening. And therapy meaning care of the soul, right? Therapy is therapia, and it's care. And because it's psychology, psyche is psychology, is about the soul, and logos is the second part of the psychology word, which is knowledge of. So depth therapy is about deep care and knowledge of the soul. So the therapist is necessarily in it with the client, which usually means they have to have made the journey to Hades and back, right? The 4th task. So not everybody has to make the 4th task journey, but people that are going to work in the capacity of therapists, in particular depth therapists, they will at some point be called to make that journey for sure. And it's something that happens, and it's pretty hard to resist it when it happens, because it's sort of the only thing that you can do, right?
Yeah, I really do think that's a differentiating point. And as I said, for me, it just seems to bring a whole lot more humanness to the process. It seems intuitively the right orientation, to be of service to another, to actually be right there in it, with them. And so that's been extremely kind of helpful for me personally, and probably others in terms of our community, because I believe at the 5th direction, that's what we're all doing together. Like, we're just
right,
all
as a container, as a
as a
kiva,
container.
sacred space. Yeah, that's so beautiful.
Yeah. When we sit together in our sacred spaces, we're all just in the muck together, and the idea of depth orientation really being about amplifying the muck as opposed to turning away from it.
Yeah. And from an alchemical perspective, that muck is where the gold is, right? Like that's the prima materia, the original material, the muck, the decay, the hard stuff that we're pushing away, that we have to go into in order to find that gold, or the philosopher's stone. And so to do that in the container of sacred space with the support, like that's just priceless, right? Whether you're doing that in therapy or with the 5th direction, that's just such a great way to do it.
Yeah, no, agreed. And, and what we see, or at least what I saw in the world, and it was part of the reason why this community began, was just the missing of that stage in the alchemical process, the missing of the negredo or the black stage, and just
Mhm.
going for gold, so to speak, um,
Yeah.
without having to do the work. I thought there's a lovely analogy around elite sports that we were actually talking about prior to beginning here, between us. What we see on the TV is maybe the last race and then the medal presentation. But what's missing on the television is the negredo. Is the
Right.
black stage and the years and years of adversity and injury and defeat that particular sports person has had to overcome to get there. And so I feel like
Yes.
that's a lovely metaphor for the way we are in culture. It's what's visible is just maybe the final ordeal and then the medal presentation, and we don't really
Yeah.
get to see the muck.
Yeah. Which is the longest stage. The in alchemy, the Negredo is it's the longest, and for certain people it can be years, many years, right? James Hollis was one of my teachers when I was a student at Pacifica. I forget what he was teaching. Something on the daimon, though, on the calling. And I was thick in it at that point. And I put in my hand, and I was like, "So how long? How long am I going to be doing this? Because it is not a good time." And he was great. He said, some people have to be in it for 10 years. And he said his personal experience was it was 10 years of like really being in the thick, hard stuff, right? And that was also my experience as well. But I also found it heartening that there was a framework and it wasn't always going to be that hard, and I think that's what's so important for people to know when they're really in the in the fourth task in Hades, or in the muck in alchemy, or when their lives are falling apart because of crisis and having the big spiritual awakening, it is a process. It's a psychological developmental process that is really natural. It's supposed to happen. There's a lot of ways we can understand that process, but when we recognize it's a process, then we aren't quite so freaked out. Like, there's a beginning and there's an end, and there is a pathway through this. It'll be unique for each person, but there is a pathway through it, right?
Yeah, it's always nice to hear that, isn't it? That's the case. Like, you're not locked in your bedroom for 10 years either. That if I take some of the perspective, particularly through the myths and the stories that we hear, you can actually be in the greater, you can be under the earth and on top of the earth at the same time. So I feel like people in their lives, you can be going through that ashes work, that blackness, but you can still operate in the world. There's this idea that it is possible. It doesn't mean that everything comes to a grinding halt and you're just in this place of despair for a decade. That there are things still happening to you, and you're still functioning to some degree as a human being, and that duality of being in two places at once almost is possible. How would you speak to that?
More than possible. I think it's necessary,
Mm.
because I think it's the day-to-day life that both keeps us anchored and grounded. Otherwise, we might just float away into our bedrooms and close the door, or off into the world and disappear, or who knows what. So it keeps us grounded, but also that's the place where the complexes will be activated, in our day-to-day work environment, home environment, relational environments. And so that is the material that we're being called to work on and look at. And so, to circle back to romantic love, that arena is really powerful for bringing up a lot of those different complexes and feelings and activations, and learning who we are and what our values are outside of culture, and learning to speak up for those, and having to tease all of that apart, differentiating from culture. These are all things that happen because we're in and of the world, while internally we're down in Hades trying to figure out how to cross the river Styx with our oatcakes. It's not easy.
I love that idea, and I would wholeheartedly agree. And I'm sure many listening that in the cauldron of a relationship with another, you learn the most about yourself. There's no doubt about that.
Mhm.
That's
Yeah.
certainly been true of my life, and yeah, it's very, very true, and it's a great example of that. You know, I was thinking about what James Hollis said about depression too. That he saw it as a blessing in some degrees. I think in one of his books he calls it like Ariadne's thread. You know, it gives you, it makes the thread appear, you know, in depression, that you can follow through the labyrinth, you know, to reach that goal or to reach that understanding. And I think that, you know, when you look at the contemporary views of mental health, is just to be avoided, or at least depression and anxiety to be avoided at all costs, even medicated away. It's a very
Mhm.
different viewpoint, isn't it?
Well, and when we medicate it away, so first of all, I think people that are prone to depth psychology have a certain probably disposition towards depression, and maybe hopefully some tolerance to it as well. What happens when we medicate it away is that we thwart the awakening that's trying to happen within our psyche. The development doesn't really happen. And so we can end up, not that I'm actually anti-medication, I'm not at all. I think allopathic medicine, Western medicine goes quite nicely with depth psychology. But if we're only doing Western medicine and we're only medicating and not doing the other pieces of the work, then the growth doesn't really happen. So we can do both at the same time, and it works fantastic, really, because it can boost somebody up enough to not be too afraid to do the work, which is really helpful. Personally, getting familiar with depression, I find winter, particularly winter in Canada, is excruciatingly dark and heavy and difficult for me. And I probably clinically would classify as depressed most winters, but I actually don't mind it. I like the interning, I like the quiet. I feel very much like a bear in hibernation. I like the dream life. I get really quite creative in winter and do a lot of writing and reflecting. And so working with the depression in a generative way by being inwardly reflective is what moves it through, right? And it's actually incredibly creative. It's an incredibly creative time. Yeah.
Yeah,
So how we push away depression in particular, because it's so rampant in our culture, we're robbing ourselves of a very soulful experience, right? Psyche, soul, she's very mournful and suicidal, and she's always up in some sort of depression about something of I can'tness, right? So it is kind of the nature of soul to not be, effervescent and bubbly and jovial in the tasks. At the end, she gives birth to pleasure. So it does lead, it does lead to the promise of the child, the girl child that she gives birth to at the end. The name is often translated as pleasure or harmony. So it does, um, I think hope is the word I want to say. It offers hope of the tasks and the suffering and the despair do lead to the promise of a life that is more harmonious and more pleasurable, right?
mm. Mm. And it's interesting you use the word promise rather than the absolute guaranteed delivery. It's just a potential. It's just a promise, isn't it?
It's a potential because not everybody can do the tasks, right? If we don't do the inner work and the reflection and get the support in the community, because that's very often part of the task is pulling community around you. If we don't do the work of these tasks and the development and integrate them into our lives, then it's not a guaranteed, right? It won't happen. So
Mm. Yeah, you know, and by the way, I want to say thank you for this conversation because it's a delicate one. It's certainly a delicate one with particular views that are out there, and I agree with you about the medicinal model as well. I'm certainly not completely dismissing it either, and I think there's definitely a way that they can work hand in hand. Again, perhaps it's something to do with being in the tension of two things. Um,
mhm,
so
mhm.
there's definitely that for sure. And I also feel, you know, and others may resonate with this that are listening. There's certainly a stream of depression style issues that run through my family ancestrally from a long way back, and I know that I've carried that into my own life, and I've seen it in a sibling and in parents and very definitely in myself. But in my early days, I saw it as a threat, and I saw it as potentially, make the potential to come completely off the rails. And now, at age, coming up to 54 in a couple of days, I actually see it as a true gift. It's almost like a friend. And when I'm having one of those days, perhaps in the middle of a winter, it'll be that Simon and Garfunkel lyric, "Hello, darkness, my old friend." And there's something very comforting and warming about it, almost like a familiarity. Oh, it's like, oh, like, welcome back. And now I can take myself to a place to say, what have you come to teach me? What are you
Yes.
showing? What are you showing me?
Yeah, that's such a nice way to say it. And I think that is, with age, we get to understand the patterns and rhythms of things. And because we live in a society that values productivity and output and, high achieving, it's all very frenetic, fast, solar energy. And so when we come to that place where we're meant to turn inward and, rest, we're back to rest and recovery from the sports metaphors that we were talking about earlier. When it's time to rest, it's like we haven't been taught that, oh, this is actually sacred time as well, right? It's the time of inward turning. And I want to say it's that time of the feminine principle, where it's, although I'm trying not to use that word, but it kind of is, where we go into that darkness and the unconscious and the slower receptivity, where when we're with Apollonian consciousness, it's much more solar and fast and productive and active, and we have to follow the rhythms and the seasons, right?
Now, Stacey, I wanted to open up an opportunity for you to is there some readings from your books or something that you perhaps wanted to give that were pertinent to this conversation?
Yeah. Maybe I'll read, since we've had this topic today, so I'll read from Love and Soul Making on the one and the many, and a little section I wrote in there because it seems to be a nice little theme in this conversation about just tensions and different perspectives that seem so disparate but actually aren't so disparate. So this is on page 24. One and many. Jung used the term self to describe the center of the unconscious and consciousness as the mediating archetype with an impetus toward wholeness. The notion of the self belongs to the monotheistic fantasy. However, we can simply call it the greater in us with a capital G. As part of the individuation process, the ego reorients to being in service to the self. The I of ego consciousness no longer understands itself as the central organizing principle. It comes to realize its rightful place is part of that which is greater. The self is akin to a monotheistic fantasy or to one central archetypal figure that is the ordering principle. Jung also introduced us to the pantheon of archetypes, which he likened to Greek and Roman mythological figures. The self can be seen as the one and the pantheon as the many. We can also view these as spirit, which is analogous to the one, and soul, which is analogous to the many. Jung's self is a symbol of unity in multiplicity. I'll read just a little bit more about this. The soul, from the soul's viewpoint, the psyche does not require the centers and unifying aim that we find in spiritual traditions and symbols of the self. It is a dynamic, polycentric totality, and its center lies with whatever god or myth is constellated in that moment, or oftentimes with more than one. Archetypal psychology, developed by James Hillman, doesn't recognize wholeness or totality as the telos of psychological growth. the fantasy image of wholeness and individuation belongs to classical Jungian psychology, such as Jung, von Franz, Johnson, Hollis, Neumann, and so on, and is a monotheistic myth of the self as the unifying principle. Post-Jungians have expanded the notion to include soul-making as the development of relationships between consciousness and the unconscious pantheon of archetypal forces. In other words, there is a movement away from monotheism toward polytheism as a soul perspective. I hold both these notions and relate to them in a dialectic. It seems paradoxical to toggle in conversation between a fantasy or singular of wholeness and a fantasy of conscious relatedness to a pantheon. However, as they both spring forth from the psyche as the fantasy maker, they are useful lenses. These are not opposites that require a resolution, but rather there is a tension to hold between them. The dialectics we are talking about are monotheism and polytheism, self and pantheon, one and many, and spirit and soul. These pairs or syzygies are related to each other. We can use them to compare perspectives as they are all ways of imagining the ineffable in order to make it comprehensible. So I'll leave it there. That was quite a bit. So that's what I wrote about, at least as a little piece of it, in exploring the one and many and the self and the polytheism. The one part I wanted to maybe highlight in there is that from that classical Jungian orientation, when we go through that big alchemical process or the awakening, the individuation process, how it's described classically is the conscious personality or the ego gets reoriented around the self so that it is in service to the self rather than the first half of life, which is, developing the ego. And then all of a sudden, whoa, the ego's not the only one. It's on the bus. There's a whole bunch. So then it changes the orientation to be in service to that which is greater. That's a very classical Jungian orientation, and it's one I agree with. I just also agree with that soul perspective of there's a lot more going on all the time that we can invite in and look through.
I'm definitely with you there, Stacey. I agree. Maybe I'll take a moment for everyone just to let that sit and settle. I guess what I'm thinking from here, looking at the time, we did start a little late. I've probably got another maybe 10, 15 minutes tops left here, but I'm thinking it might be a good time to kind of open it up to some people that are with us now. Although what I should say, I wanted to mention before that is there were some references in the conversation so far quite directly to the story of Psyche and Eros. And for those that haven't read it, there is a rendition inside on our platform at the Fifth Direction. Or of course, you could also just grab Stacey's book, because I'm sure there's at least an outline in there, if not a full telling of the story, I would imagine.
It's a full telling, yeah.
Full telling, yeah. There you go. So
yes, yeah.
Either way, we've got you covered. So with that, I guess I'm really happy to kind of open the floor and see if there are any threads in the conversation that Stacey and I have been having that you might want to pull on or weave a little further.
I have so many questions. I don't know where to start, Dr. Shelby. It's just there's a profundity of stuff in what you're saying. I mean, there's all the scholarly side of the view and the books and everything, which would take us, I don't know how long. And then there's I'm really interested in the clinical or the therapeutic application of what you do. And I'm just interested in, well, first of all, I presume you do individuals, couples, and maybe broader groups. I'm not sure. So maybe you can just elucidate a little bit. But I am interested in the sense that you're coming from such a profundity of knowledge of Jungian and other, experts in this field, that you know, for a humble lay man, woman coming in to see you either as an individual or as a couple, how much preparation would we need to do? How much work would we need to do? And would that be your expectation of individuals and couples, that they do work on stuff, whether it's reading or sessions or other than what you're actually talking about? It's just, to me, it's a fascinating area, because I think so many people want solutions. You know, I mean, our partnership was good. We were in love, whatever, the old Eros and Psyche stuff. You know, now we're this. You know, we're broken, we're separate, we're damaged individually and as a partnership. What the fuck? You know, and so many people, including myself, have gone through that and continue to go through that in terms of the disintegration of what they had. And it's probably the culture that we're in that doesn't help either. But sorry, that's a long kind of spewing out question, but just very interested in terms of the practical side of what you do, and also from a fifth direction point of view. What Asher does is amazing, miraculous, it's magical. However, and you won't mind me saying this, where I think a lot of men, particularly the younger men, don't know how to proceed is, what do I do with all of this? You know, listening to the myths, doing some of the breath work, whatever. Some of them don't do a lot, but what do I then do? Because men are always looking for outcomes and solutions and way forward. Sorry, that's a long question, but thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, I feel like that both with you and Marie, I feel like we could do a whole other hour each, actually. So to pick up the threads that feel like we can do in a short time. The practicalities of how it works. So I have my private practice. I also have shameless self-promotion at this moment. I also have a collection of therapists that are depth-oriented therapists. One actually lives in Canberra. So it's online, depththerapy.com. And they're also available through my website too, which is drstacyshelby.com. So right now we have three associates that are under me and myself, and I supervise them. All of them have training and experience in depth psychology. And, you know, a fundamental premise of therapy is you meet people where they are. So people show up with wherever they're at with, you know, sometimes they have orientation to depth psychology. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they've done, you know, CBT and DBT and all of the mainstream counseling approaches, and, you know, finding 4 things that are red isn't calming their anxiety. Well, of course not, because it's not dealing with the underlying issue, right? So, you know, they've done lots of different modalities and they're ready to try something else. And Marie, that is, I don't know if that's the case, but that's perhaps where things are at with you, where you've tried lots of things already, it sounds like. So people show up with where they're at. Often people like to work with the body. They like to work with dreams. They like to work with their interpersonal relationships, vocational issues and calling. So sometimes there's what I would call other symptoms, such as depression, anxiety, addiction. Addiction can be to any number of things. So there's a particular thing that's a problem. And we go, those are all doorways into, you know, what we're exploring. So really all it requires is a person's willingness to look inwardly at themselves at a pace that is manageable. So when we're poking around in the shadow and trauma and wounds, we're treading very carefully, right? It's treacherous territory. We're down here in Hades. So, you know, we've got our little oat cakes and our coins, and we're going to go and face Cerberus, the dog. And, you know, we do that together at a pace that's right. And often that takes a long time. A lot of my clients I've worked with for years at this point. And lots of them don't have any orientation to depth psychology at all, but in terms of a framework, but it resonates for them just as a human being, feeling seen and heard and related to. Yeah. So I think that would be a bit of an answer to your question in any case. Yeah. Oh, and the other thing I would add is active imagination, which I started to touch on with Marie, would be another piece that we would sometimes bring in as a depth psychology practice too. Mhm. Thank you, Tom.
I'm curious, Stacey, we've touched a little bit on dream tending. And that's not something that we've dug into kind of deeply in the community yet. I guess we're kind of trying to find ways, because I think it's extremely important, but we haven't kind of found a way that works within the community framework. But I was interested to note that you are a certified clinical dream tender, and I think
Right.
if I'm not mistaken, you actually offer a course in it, or there's a way.
And I have done workshops and groups. I'm not at the moment. Ciara, one of the therapists that works for me, we were talking about that. I think she's going to develop a dream course. She actually just wrote a blog for the first of this month that's on my website, on both websites, drstaceyshelby.com and onlinedepththerapy.com, which is a how to remember your dreams blog, which people often say, oh, I don't remember my dreams, or I barely remember them. There's like 9 or 10 like really pragmatic ways to help you remember your dreams. Also, practically both books, I used methodology called alchemical hermeneutics, a research methodology that recognizes the unconscious and soul as part of the research. And dreams are a valid part of that hermeneutic, of that way of getting information. So the way I write, I inherently weave in my personal experience, my dreams, my understanding of my dreams. It's like ridiculously vulnerable, the stuff I talk about in my personal life, in my writing, because honestly, it's kind of where I process. I'm working it through. And so I'm processing and working through, and then I end up rewriting 20 times because I'm processing and working through. But dreams are a very big part of that processing and research and writing for me. So even just reading how I work with dreams will activate them for people. Also, just listening to the stories and the myth, you're speaking directly to the soul, and or your soul is being spoken directly to. And so those just work at an intrapsychic level, at a mythic level. So we don't have to go directly into the traumas, like that second task of confronting the rams head on. That's just destructive. So we can work at it from a mythical perspective and go around it and create the transformation without that really direct confrontational harmful response, right?
Yeah, I've always found that I dream more if we've just had a storytelling circle that night. I always tend to dream a bit more lucidly, I guess, and also have more retention of the dream. So I find that that's interesting. So yeah, I mean, I'd recommend to everyone here and everyone listening, some form of dream tending practice is very, very important. I'm a firm believer in, just quite simply, that it's the compensatory function of the psyche, which is, I think, at the base level, the Jungian point of view.
Yeah, it would be one of the functions. I would also add there's things like, the ants of the first task, they will sort out and do the organizing for us in our sleep and in our dreams, right? So there's just so much that goes on within the psyche during dream time. My goodness, we're there for so many hours of our life, right?
I think there's actually some science which is arriving in the last few years. That, we say, "Oh, just sleep on it," or
Yes.
all these cliches that we have are actually scientifically provable now.
Yeah. I think I rarely make a big decision without sleeping on it. Partly because, like Marie, my body wisdom isn't always immediate, right? And so when I don't have that immediate gut, oh, yes, this is a yes, I need to do that, and it's clear, then I will rely on needing to sleep on it to let the ants kind of sort it out in my sleep, and clarity to come through that way. Yeah.
I think that's lovely. Look, I am conscious of time. I just Nick, I just was wondering if there was something spinning around in your head that you wanted to share by way of even a statement, let alone a question.
No, thank you. Thanks everyone for you, Dr. Shelby, for your time. I won't take up time with questions, but I guess probably the big takeaway from what you'd said today, I think for me, was just that importance of when you're in doing the Ashes work, that integration with real life, and having, you can't shy away from real life at that point in time, shut yourself into a bedroom, because of the importance of bringing those real issues which you then need to work upon. And I thought that was, that was really, really pertinent, and probably brings back to what Tom was saying as well, of how do you integrate that? And I think that is the integration process of having those two things kind of working side by side. So I can't wait to read your book. It's going to be fantastic. And I could have had a million questions for dreams and all of these things, but thank you. Thanks for your time.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us, Nick. I appreciate it.
Well, I think that brings us to a natural close. It's really just left for me to thank Stacey so much for your time. It's really appreciated. I know it's coming into evening there if it's not already well into it. So thanks again. Wonderful conversation. I really feel like there's enough to do this again, if not several more times. If you'll be willing to come back and join our community again, I think that'd be great. For members here, Stacey and I are talking about ways of perhaps weaving some things together, particularly in reference to the online depth psychology portal, to make kind of a pathway for us as members of the Fifth Direction community, if you're looking for something a little bit more, to moving into that sort of counselling or therapy space, to offer a clean pathway into what Stacey's offering. So I guess, Stacey, you and I will talk about that a little bit further as to exactly how that looks, but the machinations are underway, which is really lovely, because I feel like everything that Stacey's bringing into the world and her way of being of service to the world just is so on point for us in our community. So it's an absolute blessing to have found you and for you to have connected with us. So thank you.
Likewise, it's really my pleasure to be here, and I love chatting with people about depth issues. And so thank you, and thank you for showing up and your time today as well. I appreciate it. Look forward to future conversations.
Absolutely. Well, with that, my friends, we can say goodbye to Stacey and each other, and until next time, much love.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Stacey.
thank you so much.
Thanks